Hello and welcome to this episode of Life with Lizzie Lee, powered by the China Project. I am your host, Lizzie. Joining me today is Professor Ellie Friedman, Associate Professor and Chair in the Department of International and Comparative Labor at Cornell's ILR School. Professor Friedman's most recent book is called The Urbanization of People, the Politics of Development, Labor Markets, and Schooling in the Chinese City. Professor Friedman, welcome to be here.
Thanks for having me.
So, Professor Friedman, speaking of China's labor statistics, can you please shed light on why Chinese authorities suddenly stopped publishing its youth unemployment data? How bad is the unemployment situation in China right now?
Yeah, well, when I saw that they had stopped publishing that data, the first thing that it made me think of was a precedent from 2006. And China used to report something that's called mass incidents. These are collective actions that involve 25 people or more. And over the course of the 2000s, those numbers were continuing to go up. In 2005, they reached 87,000. And in 2006, they just decided to stop reporting it. So it immediately sort of thought back to that and a tendency that we see when the numbers are really bad to just sort of go dark. There are some differences though, right? Because one of the things that is important with respect to unemployment is that this is something that's of interest to a lot of different kinds of actors, foreign governments, foreign investors, corporations, et cetera. And so they actually probably will not be able to go dark forever. And I think in contrast to the question of mass incidents. So we don't actually know. There aren't good alternative sources of data available yet. I'm sure if the government continues to not release them, then people will find creative workarounds. But for the moment, we don't exactly know. It is safe to assume that the number has continued to gone up from where it was previously, which was over 21%. So this represents the highest level of youth unemployment that China has seen for a very long time, and so therefore a serious issue for sure.
This might be a stupid question, but there is this perception that unemployment figures in China have long been manipulated to appear artificially low and also stable. So what prevents Beijing from simply fabricating the youth unemployment number this time around?
It's a really good question. There's lots of suggestions that many of these numbers are, in fact, fabricated. I have a colleague here at Cornell named Jeremy Wallace, who's recently written a book on the politics of statistics. And one of the main things that he talks about is how the Chinese state is very good at focusing on one particular number. And the number that they've really focused on for many years was GDP. Of course, zero COVID, they were really focused on that zero number. And I think that focusing on lots of different numbers can be difficult, right? And so right now there's different kinds of economic indicators that they're looking at. And when there's some kind of uncertainty about how those numbers should relate to each other, I think it opens up the room for kind of uncertainty and political contestation. And one reason, and this is, I should say, purely speculative, of course, I have no information about this, and I think very few people do, but one possibility is that as that number continued to go up, it actually did become quite politicized, right? And so the increasing youth unemployment rate was seen as a problem. So it's conceivable to me that the lower levels of the apparatus are not faithfully reporting numbers up the ladder. And so therefore, when you get to the national level, they're looking at this and they're sort of saying, well, these numbers aren't really adding up, or it seems as if there's some issues here. So there's a possibility that, in fact, it is a technical issue. I don't think it's an unresolvable technical issue, but that may be part of what's going on. All that being said, not reporting the numbers is clearly bad for trust in the system. Having some sense about what unemployment is at, something a lot of people are interested in. This is not just academics like me. And so I think that at a certain point, they will have to continue to report it. But it has been politicized.
Very helpful. Thank you so much. So how much cause for concern is warranted from Chinese policy's point of view? Is this youth unemployment primarily a result of, post-COVID lockdowns and, the lockdowns' detrimental impact on China's service and private industry, or does it indicate deeper-seated issues tied to China's structural economic challenges?
Yeah, certainly the situation coming out of zero COVID is a major factor. There's a lot of self-inflicted damage that was caused by the lockdowns, and the recovery has not been as strong as people were anticipating. But I do think it's important to note that there are longer term structural issues at play here, and that many of these things were already apparent before COVID even happened. So the first and most obvious one is this inability to facilitate domestic consumption, shifting away from this reliance on exports and investment-led growth and having more domestic consumption. This is something that policymakers have been very aware of and have been agitating about for about 20 years now. And we can talk about why they haven't really had much success there. Of course, there's been the issue of geopolitics, of the Trump led trade war that started in 2018. It's not just the United States, though. It's many other of US allies in Western Europe and in East Asia that have been seeking alternatives. So I don't think it's full decoupling, but the China plus one strategy. And we do see more supply chains looking to locate in other places. Again, this is not new. As just one example, you can look at Samsung Electronics. So Samsung, I think as of 2019, didn't have any production facilities in China anymore, and they used to have quite a bit. They've been relocated largely to Vietnam. And so there we see, this was not a direct response to the trade war. This has been going on for a while in response to the increasing cost of land and labor and other things in China. And then the final big thing, of course, is real estate. Now, the real estate market, which is huge for employment and construction and associated manufacturing for home appliances and all the rest, is in a particularly bad position now. But there's been concern about the real estate market for quite a long time. And again, this is a structural change in the economy that everybody has seen coming for quite a while and preceded the COVID lockdowns.
Fantastic. So what choices does Beijing have at its disposal to address the situation, both in the urgent short term, but also in the long term?
Yeah, well, just thinking about the short term, I think the primary tool that they have at their disposal and that they are probably already beginning to use will not actually help that much, which is pressuring companies not to do layoffs. This kind of pressure can be applied directly to state-owned enterprises, but they can also apply this kind of pressure to private companies as well. This is a good thing, I think, for government to do in an economic downturn. In terms of thinking about precedents, we saw this happen in the 2008 economic crisis, where there was a lot of pressure on companies not to do mass layoffs. I saw some of this. I was doing field research at the time, and I would go to some companies and this was shortly after the crisis, and they would say very proudly they hadn't done any layoffs. What I found out later is that they had not laid off any of their permanent employees, but in fact, they had gotten rid of lots of the temporary workers. And in some of these workplaces, temporary workers or the dispatch labor account for up to 50% of the workforce, right? The reason that I think that specific method might not have a big impact on youth employment in particular is that benefits the already existing workforce, right? So if they're telling the companies don't do layoffs now, well, that's fine and good for middle-aged and older workers, but for people who are just graduating and coming into the workforce, it actually might make it less likely for those companies to want to hire new people, right? So I think that is something of a double-edged sword during an economic downturn. The government can pressure companies and maybe even give them subsidies to hire new graduates, and I have seen some reports that that's happened in some of the provinces. This, of course, if the government is going to pay for it, also requires some sort of fiscal outlay, and that's at a time when a lot of local governments are under a lot of fiscal pressure to begin with. Another thing that they could do, and this has been debated in Beijing, is giving people money, right? And this is something that happened in the United States and many other places. Just send people checks, get them to go out there and spend that money, and as a way of stimulating consumption. It seems like they're pretty reluctant to do that for various sorts of reasons, but that is one option that's on the table. And the other thing they can do is they can encourage more borrowing. That's been the basic playbook going back to 2008. And they can build more stuff. I think most economists think that is going to worsen their long-term prospects, because that, of course, adds to a debt that is already, at pretty unsustainable levels.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, in terms of the long-term things, the short answer is they need to rebalance the economy, and that's a bigger sort of a question. But I think ultimately that's really where things need to go. There does need to be less of a reliance on exports and investment, and more on domestic consumption.
Right? Many economists have argued that basically Xi Jinping has to navigate that shift from an investment and export-driven growth model to a more balanced, consumption-oriented approach. But what's preventing Xi Jinping from making that transition?
Well, the short answer is politics. And of course, when you're dealing with the Chinese system, this is not transparent. And so it's a little bit difficult to know what's going on inside. We do know the outcomes, right? As I've already mentioned, we can go back and see over 20 years, you can see Wen Jiabao saying things in 2004 about the need to increase domestic consumption and to rebalance the economy. So this is a very old debate among policymakers. And so part of the question is, why haven't they been able to do this thing that there's really strong consensus among economists and policymakers that they need to do? Well, we can think about two major areas of reform. These are not the only ones, but two major areas of reform that need to be addressed. And then we can talk about why they're so difficult. So the first is labor reforms. And this is what I wrote my first book on. The fact that you have high levels of inequality and that you don't have enough domestic consumption, this is not something that is unique to China. Many countries undergoing rapid industrialization have found themselves in a similar place. In order to address that, though, you need to have some workplace-based reforms that have mostly been addressed by having labor movements in other countries. So you have labor organization that can push for systems of institutionalized collective bargaining, granting workers the right to strike. And these are all things that puts pressure on the employers at the level of the firm to increase wages, increase benefits, and that gives workers, of course, higher wages, more money in their pocket, and allows them to then spend more money. And this is something that many countries have undergone historically. But when it comes to the politics, of course, this is very difficult. If you see the rhetoric coming out of Beijing for a long time, it actually suggests that they are kind of in favor of some of these sorts of reforms, right? The whole idea of common prosperity, and even going back to some of the rhetoric from the Hu Jintao era, it seems as if they wanted to advance these kinds of reforms, and they didn't. And I think that one of the reasons is that they are concerned that if they allow these kinds of labor organizations to develop in the workplace, that they could pose a political threat. And so it's that concern about political instability that's preventing them from making the kinds of reforms that are necessary for workers to be paid more. The second and intimately connected problem is thinking about the system of social welfare, right? Now, China, as a share of its GDP, spends considerably less on social welfare than other developed countries, and less than a lot of developing countries, including places like Brazil. It's pretty clear that one of the reasons domestic consumption in China is depressed is precisely because of that, because people are worried about getting sick, because they have inadequate health coverage. They're worried about the cost of sending their children to education, sending them to school, and they're worried about pensions, right? And about what will happen to them in retirement. China does not have a national health insurance system. It does not have a national pension system. It's highly fractured at the level of individual cities. And when you have 300 million migrant workers, people who are living outside of their places of official registration, that means they don't have guaranteed access to those services. So one obvious thing that you could do would be to increase spending on social protections in general, and health and pensions and in education, but also to create a more nationalized system, so that these kinds of benefits are portable, so that if you move from one place to another for a job, you don't have to be worried that you're going to lose access to education for your children or healthcare, all the rest. And again, all of those things are necessary. If you want people to spend the money that they have now, they need to have some confidence that if they get sick, they won't go bankrupt. And these are also incredibly politically challenging, because if you think about the system that China currently has, which is highly decentralized, if you wanted to create a more regionally equitable system, that means going to many of the most powerful people in the country, in places like Beijing, Shanghai, et cetera, and telling them, we're going to take away some of the resources from your children's schooling, some of your pension money, and we're going to redistribute it to rural Henan province or rural Sichuan province or wherever. they're not going to like that. People in those cities also feel under a lot of pressure, and they are very politically connected, right? So pushing through those kinds of reforms is difficult, even for someone as powerful as Xi Jinping.